She was 22, and she could barely afford the coffee she carried, but she kept walking to the bus stop with a wax paper sandwich in her hand. That sentence lived in Aaliyah Cooper's head, the way some people keep a prayer they never quite speak out loud, a small, stubborn habit that shaped the hours before dawn. It was 6:15 a.m. when she stepped off the bus with her thermos steaming into the cold. The light over the corner pharmacy still flickered as if it hadn't yet decided to wake for the day. She folded her scarf tighter, the wool rough against her neck, and looked for the familiar shape. Flattened cardboard, a donated army blanket pulled up to the chin, the slight rise and fall of a man asleep in a city that mostly passed him by. George Fletcher slept like he was conserving warmth in a world that had no business asking for it. He wasn't young. His hair was the grey of old rain clouds, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes that told of a life of movement. When he was awake, he kept his back straight and would lift his chin to meet a stranger's gaze, the way someone might offer a business card. He had a dignity about him that didn't belong to his situation. Aaliyah always noticed that first, and then the rest. She set the food down carefully on the wax paper so it wouldn't slide into the dust. Peanut butter, a banana, a coffee that was never as hot by the time she reached him as she wanted it to be. She would sit on the curb for a minute, her back braced against the bus stop pole, and watch him smooth the paper and angle his face toward the steam. It was a ritual, small, exacting and ridiculous when you thought about the math of it. She worked 2 jobs, studied nights, and paid more in rent than she sometimes thought she deserved, yet every morning she did it anyway. "Morning, George," she would say, voice low, the way she addressed patients at the hospital where she spent evenings washing trays and filling water pitchers. He would nod and sometimes tell a story about a place that sounded far away. Helicopters, dust, missions he described with a loose grin that made Aaliyah think of old movies. There were facts that didn't line up, small inconsistencies that would have been enough for someone else to write him off as a man who told tall tales to keep company with himself. Aaliyah, though, listened the way people listen to the weather. Because it was there, because it mattered if it changed. At the hospital she worked the late shift in the dietary department. Mrs. Carter, the kitchen supervisor, was a woman whose laugh made the pots rattle and whose practical hands could turn scraps into something salvageable. She watched Aaliyah tuck a sandwich into a small bag before sunrise more than once. "You could keep it," she said one night, pressing a spare granola bar into Aaliyah's palm like an offering. "Take 2. Aaliyah refused with a smile and a small shake of her head. The truth was not that she wanted to be the one doing this out of some performance. She couldn't explain why she kept giving. It felt less like charity and more like remembering that the world still had people inside it. Her life was a cautious ledger. Classes 3 nights a week for nursing prerequisites, shifts at the hospital that extended past midnight, and a day job at a coffee shop on weekends where she learned to balance a tray with one hand while answering a student's question with the other. Rent notices accumulated in neat stacks on her kitchenette counter like quiet accusations. She ate at odd hours and made meals out of rice and whatever vegetables were on sale. Her mother was a phone call she sometimes couldn't afford the time to take. They spoke in the clipped, efficient way of people who live in different economies. When the eviction notice appeared beneath her door one October morning, she found it between 2 napkin dispensers and a stack of trays in the cafeteria. She sat on the linoleum and read it 3 times, her heart in the steadiness of someone used to bad news by inches. She could pay what was due if she took on more hours, if she deferred another one of the one-time expenses she kept promising to fix later. She would do it, she told herself. She would figure it out. The lease was a shadow that never left the small world she had managed to build. A narrow room above a laundromat, a window that looked out over the alley where pigeons organized their little governments. It was her room, and it felt miraculous in the quiet hours between shifts. She did not tell George about the notice. She didn't tell him about most things. Their relationship existed in the obvious, coffee passing from one hand to another, stories that skated the edges of the unbelievable, a silence that was comfortable. And in the implicit rules Aaliyah had set for herself. She was not there to save him. She was there to disturb the erasure of him, even if only for 15 minutes a day. On days when the city treated them with a little more indifference than usual, people passed like a film strip of excuses. A man with a briefcase stepped across the blanket without looking. A woman hurried by and adjusted her scarf, pretending she hadn't noticed the presence of another person leaning against the signpost. Once, a delivery driver bent down and kicked the corner of the cardboard as if testing gravity. George didn't react. His face, when he finally looked up, was not angry but empty, in a way that felt like a missing chapter. The contrast between the morning and the hospital became a kind of moral map for Aaliyah. At the hospital she wore scrubs and a name tag, and the authority that came with being paid to be useful. In the morning she wore the same coat, but felt small in it, like the fabric hadn't yet filled out around the edges. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and the steady thrum of mechanical things that made people feel safer. The bus stop smelled of leftover rain and the city trying to shake off its night. There were tiny injustices that collected along the margins of her days. A patient would be billed for a test that clearly should have been covered. Forms required boxes to be checked in triplicate before anything could be done. Someone would point to a binder and say the right person needed to sign it. That person would be somewhere else. At home, Aaliyah would read articles between shifts about benefits delayed, about long spreadsheets of veterans whose records were lost inside bureaucracy like letters in a house whose owner had moved decades ago. The news felt labyrinthine. For Aaliyah, the labyrinth had a face, George, who remembered a tape of service and a photograph the size of a postage stamp, who sometimes left his words unfinished and waited for someone to pick them up. Then, one morning, George wasn't there. She walked to the bus stop at 6:15 and found only the empty outline of cardboard, a cup of cold coffee tipped over by the wind, and the impression of absence. The city hummed like usual. The bus driver made a joke into his radio, and a woman with a stroller apologized to no one for the tightness of the space. Aaliyah stood with the still warm sandwich she had tucked in her coat and felt as if someone had pressed a thumb into the map of her day and left an indentation that her fingers could not smooth out. She did what she always did. When something in the small world she inhabited shifted, she started looking. She left the sandwich at the steps of the library and then at the shelter laundry room. She asked around. The man at the newsstand shrugged and suggested places where people might go. Aaliyah checked the clinic intake, where she sometimes volunteered, even though the hours were off, and it meant missing class later. There was no sign of him. Days accumulated. The worry moved from the center of her chest to the edges where it sat like a stone. She imagined every tragically plausible scenario. That he had been taken in by someone who would be less kind than he deserved, that he had been fined for loitering, that some small injury had gone unnoticed. She tried to balance the habit of worry with the practicalities of life. There were shifts she couldn't skip, textbooks that needed highlighting. Yet every morning that week she made coffee and walked the few blocks to the bus stop, half in case and half in ritual. On the fourth morning, he was back. He looked thinner, if that was possible, and his jacket hung off his shoulders like a suit out of a thrift store. He was quieter than usual, as if the city had carved sound from his mouth and left only the motion. In his hand, held close to his chest like a relic, was an envelope sealed with a strip of yellowed tape. He slid the envelope from under his arm and set it in Aaliyah's lap, with the same carefulness he showed when he warmed his hands around his coffee. "If something happens to me, mail this," he said. His voice had that tired quality she had heard before, one made by years of saying things into empty rooms. "Promise me you'll mail it." She looked at him, then at the envelope. It had no return address. There was a single line of writing on the front, his handwriting surprisingly neat. A name, a place. The seal was stubborn. There were stamps, not the modern kind with barcodes, but older postage that made it look like a paper boat sent out to sea. Aaliyah smiled because she didn't know what else to do. "Mail it where?" she asked. He shrugged. "To someone who should know he's gone." "Who?" He didn't finish the sentence. The pause stretched like a hinge. He looked suddenly fragile, an old lamp with a loose bulb. "Just, if something happens, promise me." Promise was a large word for a small exchange, but Aaliyah found herself saying it anyway. She slid the envelope into the inner pocket of her coat, feeling the breath of paper against her ribs. That day she made a note in her phone that read, "Mail envelope if," and then left the sentence unfinished. For the rest of the morning she carried a new kind of weight. It was not heavy in the way cash is heavy. It was the kind of weight that alters all the banal mechanics of moving through a morning. At the hospital, she kept reaching into the pocket and feeling the sealed paper there. It was an absurd superstition, the way people rub a charm, but it kept her connected like a thread in a sweater. Aaliyah did not tell Mrs. Carter right away. She wasn't sure how to explain. The kitchen was loud with the clatter of trays and the shouts of nurses asking for extra bread, yet Mrs. Carter noticed the set of Aaliyah's shoulders and the way she kept checking her pocket. "You all right?" she asked, wiping her hands with a towel. Aaliyah nodded. She almost said, "He asked me to mail this if something happens." She almost said, "I promised." But those words would have been too much to carry around the kitchen, so she said instead, "Just tired." Tired was a workable translation for most things at 22 that involved working until your eyelids blurred. It was also a phrase that let her keep the envelope close, private, and, in an odd way, honored. If George asked her to remember him this way, to take a sealed piece of paper and keep it safe, she would do it. The act required no permission and no press release. It simply required fidelity. The city has a way of testing small fidelities. 2 weeks after he returned with the envelope, Aaliyah arrived at the bus stop to find George sitting with his back against the pole, his hat tipped over his eyes. He looked pale. She knelt beside him and called his name. He didn't respond at first. Then his hands twitched and he let out a sound that was neither laugh nor cry. Someone nearby dialed 911. In the swirl that followed, Aaliyah found herself making decisions that felt much larger than what she had been trained to do in class. An ambulance arrived quickly, lights slicing the morning. The EMTs moved with the purpose of people who have practiced crisis into muscle memory. One of them asked her questions, name, age, what happened, and she tried to answer between the rush of adrenaline and the odd detachment that accompanies such moments. They lifted him onto a gurney with the care of people who had seen the worst and still treated it like a person. At the hospital intake, the waiting room was a cathedral of other people's dramas. Fluorescent lights hummed. A television in the corner played a looping news cycle that felt indifferent to the man with a gash of life on a gurney down the hall. Aaliyah watched as hospital staff patted the sides of charts and called out codes in clipped voices. In the intake stack, someone found a file that had been folded and tucked into George's jacket pocket, a folded page of official-looking paper, blacked-out sections where words had been removed, stamps that read "classified" in a font that made the throat tighten. She had seen many documents in the hospital. This one looked like a map to a place she had never been. They moved him to a room that smelled like rubbing alcohol and old coffee. Aaliyah watched him through the glass, his hands flickering at the edge of sleep. Doctors and nurses spoke in low, technical tones about vitals and tests. The specifics did not make sense to her then, and the gaps where they used jargon made her feel small. But the file, the thing that had been in his coat, suggested there was a life before the cardboard that had been ironed into the lines on his face. It hinted at pages of service, of records that were, at least locally, redacted into mystery. When the staff asked for his next of kin and turned the pockets inside out, they found the photograph. A small, slightly faded portrait of a younger George in dress uniform. He didn't smile in the photograph. Instead, he offered the kind of expression that was neutral and steady and made you think of someone who had learned to hold himself like a promise. Alongside the photograph was a paper, folded tightly, with Aaliyah's name on it. Aaliyah felt the room shift, her name in his handwriting on a folded page that fluttered like something too fragile to be true. The thought that she might be the person he had appointed to guard his last practical wishes was both humbling and destabilizing. She hadn't known she mattered to him beyond the exchange of food and listening. She had not imagined she would be named in a ledger he had kept folded in his pocket. At some point, the doctors explained things with the careful neutrality of professionals. He had a cascade of conditions that the hospital could stabilize, but that might require a longer period in a facility that specialized in veterans' care. Someone mentioned benefits and paperwork, and a social worker wrote notes on a clipboard. Aaliyah kept thinking of the envelope in her coat pocket and of the photograph with the crisp lapels and the neutral smile. She left the hospital that night with sleep drained from her, and the envelope heavier than it had been that morning. The first time she had promised him, the edges had seemed like a small thing. Now the paper felt like a threshold. On the walk back to her room above the laundromat, she thought of the bus stop, of the way cardboard can be mistaken for invisibility. She thought of the classified pages they had found and of the photograph folded into his pockets. She thought of all the quiet, ordinary ways a life accumulates proof of itself. That night, the city was unusually quiet. A stray dog snuffled through an overturned trash can. A streetlight hummed. Aaliyah sat at her little kitchen table and spread the envelope on the table like someone handling a relic. There was an urge to open it right away, to know what name or address he had written, to see if there was some tidy map to the next steps. But there was also the promise she had made, the feeling that some small acts require patience, that you honor them by waiting for the right moment and the right hands. She did not open it. She wrapped it in a clean dish towel and placed it in a shoebox, with a few odd things she kept, a postcard from a cousin, a hospital badge from a volunteer stint, a pressed leaf she had found on a walk the summer before. It felt like shutting a door that might need to be opened by someone else. The next morning, the hospital called. He had worsened. Aaliyah rushed over, piecing together the different parts of her life. One bus, a borrowed hoodie over her scrubs, her heart hard with the need to be seen doing the right thing. She arrived to find him awake, but thin and patchy, with a pain that made him draw the curtains around himself. The veil of privacy the hospital provided was a small mercy. A nurse named Rachel, who had worked intake, kissed the top of his head, the way a neighbor might when they offer to water your plants. It was in that liminal space, the machine beeps, the pale curtains, a bouquet of flowers someone had left on a side table, that the world he had once inhabited seemed close enough to touch. Aaliyah traced the edges of the photograph the staff had laid on the bedside table and tried to imagine the man behind the folds of paper and the drab blanket. He turned his head toward her and, for the first time, looked like himself in private, not the man he played for the morning audience. "You kept the promise," he said, voice a rasp that belonged to a man who had been traveling for too long. "I promised," she said, and meant it. She had no sense of ceremony in her bones. Promises were practical things. Make the call, send the letter, file the form. But in his eyes, she saw a world she could not fully occupy and had not been expected to. That unspoken equation, a small kindness offered in the morning equated to a duty, settled into her as if into the lines of an old map. By the end of the week, the hospital was a different kind of theatre. Social workers came and went with clipboards. A doctor in a suit asked questions that sounded like they belonged to a different language: benefits, discharge planning, referrals to VA services. There was talk of transferring him to a facility better equipped for his needs. In the shuffle, Aaliyah kept returning to the paper in the shoebox and to the list of names scrawled in the margins of his life. She went to the post office with the envelope once, the act of mailing suddenly less trivial than ever. She pictured the envelope moving through rooms she could not see, clerks sliding papers under one another, men and women in blue uniforms reading addresses and making decisions, but she couldn't bring herself to drop it in the slot. Instead, she walked home and put it back into the shoebox, folding the towel over it like a blanket. The act of keeping it felt to her like the right one. On the edge of the hospital routine, a social worker named Dr. Patel, a calm woman with impatient glasses and a notebook that never left her side, sat with Aaliyah in a small conference room. "We found something in his pocket," she said, and explained in a slow, careful cadence what the blacked-out lines meant and what it suggested. There were redactions and stamps and the brittle paper of forms signed by hands Aaliyah had never met. The words classified and redacted were used, but no one explained the specifics. Dr. Patel's tone balanced confidentiality and the recognizable urgency of a bureaucrat who had glimpsed a larger failure. "If he's entitled to certain benefits, we need his records to process that," she said. "Sometimes those records are hard to access. Sometimes they are incomplete. Sometimes, and this is where it gets complicated, a person who served might have paperwork that's restricted for reasons of national security." Aaliyah listened and felt the map of her commitment change under her feet. She had promised to mail an envelope if something happened. She had not promised to be an advocate, an intermediary, an interpreter of redacted documents. But now that his life had threaded itself onto hers in this way, that small sealed paper felt less like a relic and more like a key. It might fit into a lock she didn't even know existed. The promise to mail the envelope, which had started as a private covenant between two people at a bus stop, was suddenly a public concern. There were forms to be filled out, phone calls to be made, names to be recorded. Aaliyah's little ledger of time, hospital evenings, class nights, weekend shifts, expanded to make space for arcs that she had not planned for. She found herself taking on tasks she had not expected to perform, sitting on a tiny plastic chair while a phone call looped on hold, writing down names and numbers she promised to return. She did these things without much fanfare. There was no grand epiphany, no sudden conversion into a crusader. She was not looking for notice. The work felt like the proper extension of what she had been doing all along, recognizing someone as human and then doing the messy administrative labor that recognition demanded. As the days folded into a pattern of check-ins and small bureaucratic errands, Aaliyah noticed how the city notices people in rhythms. A handful of neighbors came and left flowers at the hospital and wrote notes that never made it beyond the clipboard of the social worker. Mrs. Carter called a shift here and there to keep Aaliyah afloat. There was community, scattered and imperfect, like a set of mismatched plates on a shared table. One afternoon, after a double shift that left her feeling like a figure pressed flat by the heat of too many people asking things of her, Aaliyah sat on the hospital bench and watched a woman wheel a bouquet down the corridor. She thought of the photograph that had been tucked into his pocket and the way it looked like proof of a life lived with intentions that had been overwritten by time and neglect. She thought of the envelope in her shoebox, its edges soft from being handled. "She just left food at his door," someone said, as if summarizing a headline, and it sounded ridiculous and true in the same breath. For weeks, for now, she was content to be the person who fed him breakfast and who kept his sealed paper safe. She did not know in those hours that the small, quiet fidelity of that choice would be the hinge for a narrative that would reach beyond their corner of the city. She could only feel the immediate consequences, the way her chest lifted each time he smiled, the way the city seemed to rotate another fraction of a degree when she moved through it. She did not yet know where the envelope would travel, or whether the name written on its face would mean anything in the loud rooms where institutions made decisions. If this story is making you think in terms of small gestures, one sandwich, one cup of coffee, take a second to consider something you could do this week for someone who's overlooked. Share it in the comments. Sometimes small ideas become the maps others need. When George asked her to promise, he had placed faith in a stranger's reliability. People promise small things to each other all the time, to water a plant, to pick up a package. But this was different. It was the kind of promise that asked not just for a temporary favor, but for a willingness to witness a life. Aaliyah felt the responsibility like a weight that was also a blessing. Still, the envelope remained closed. There was an awkwardness to it, an uncertainty. It sat in the shoebox under the towel, waiting for the day its journey would begin. She told herself she would wait until the right time, until someone with the authority to open old, sealed things could advise her. Waiting felt like respect, and yet the city and the hospital and the thin bureaucracy around veterans' care have their own schedules. Files get misplaced. Names move from one stack to another. People die in rooms whose tenders were thin. The shoebox on Aaliyah's kitchen table was a small intervention against that drift. One night after she finished a 12-hour stretch and came home smelling of lemon-scented cleaner and hospital dust, Aaliyah sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop. She started to search for the name on the front of the envelope. The internet returned a handful of hits. There were oblique references, a notice here, a thumbnail image there, nothing definitive. Part of her wanted to stop, to let the professionals handle it, to respect the idea that certain things are complicated and not for the hands of someone who makes sandwiches for a living. But the other part of her, the part that had promised a man she barely knew, kept pushing. She didn't have a plan for what to do with the information she found. She did not yet imagine a time when the envelope would be a key to a door swung open by people in suits. She simply read, and then read more, her eyes scanning lines that made her both more curious and more frightened. The shoebox sat to her right, the towel hiding whatever Aaliyah had been given to safeguard. That night she slept badly, in the way young people with too many responsibilities do. She dreamed of post offices and sealed envelopes drifting down empty corridors. She woke before her alarm, and on instinct rather than design, slid the towel back and touched the paper. It was as if a current moved between her fingers and the sealed fold. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. Inside, an ordinary life unfolded, dishes in the sink, a textbook open to a page she had promised to memorize. The morning ritual resumed. She wrapped a sandwich, placed a banana on top, poured coffee into the thermos, and walked through the thin blue light toward the bus stop. The shoebox went with her in the form of a promise she wore but did not speak of. When she got to the stop, the cardboard was waiting. George was there, not asleep this time, but sitting upright like a man who had reclaimed a small kingdom. He smiled when she approached, and, for a moment, the universe narrowed to two people, and the steam rising from a paper cup. He reached into his pocket then and pulled out something else. A smaller envelope, folded and creased, different from the one he had pressed into her hands days before. He handed it to her with a steadier hand than she expected. "For the future," he said, "in case things get bigger." Aaliyah looked at him and then at the envelope. The city hummed around them, indifferent and resplendent. She felt the stirrings of a larger script at the edges of her life, something that might require more than sandwiches, more than nightly prayers to small gods. She thought of the shoebox and the sealed paper at home, of the photo and the blacked-out records at the hospital. For a moment, a small, suspended moment that could have been an ending or a beginning, she imagined folding every piece back into the shoebox and locking it away forever. She imagined life of practicalities and ceremonies, of finishing classes and paying rent, of holding something private because that was easier than letting it complicate everything. Then George looked at her with the kind of look that refuses simplification. "Promise me," he said again. She promised. She could not see the shape of what that promise would demand. She only knew that it had to be kept. The envelope, warm in her hands, felt like a pulse, and whatever it contained would eventually ask for action. They parted then, as they always did, her to the bus that would take her to the hospital and her studies, him to whatever street shelter or map he used to move his days along. The small human economy between them had shifted. The envelope had moved from his pocket into hers. A tiny hinge had been set. It's one thing to perform an act of kindness. It is another to take responsibility for its consequences. Aaliyah felt that difference in her bones as she climbed the bus steps and settled into a seat that had long held the shapes of other people's routines. Around her, the city continued its indifferent choreography. Some people would never know that a small paper in a coat pocket could be a lifeline. Some would not notice at all. But the morning had changed. A simple exchange, a sandwich, a promise, a sealed paper, now had the potential to reach into offices and corridors she had never imagined walking into. She thought of the word classified, and knew it carried a kind of authority that was not always aligned with humanity. She thought about what it meant to be rendered invisible by paperwork, by stamps, by the demand that some things remain sealed for reasons no one sitting at an ordinary kitchen table could explain. She did not yet know that the envelope with her name on it would become a summons that would knock at her own door, in a way that involved men in uniforms and the sudden flash of institutional attention. She did not yet know that one morning, at her own apartment door, there would be a different knock, officers with rigid lines in their sleeves and an envelope held out like an invitation and a verdict at once. For now, the story lived in the little rituals and the quiet choices. She kept the promise she made on the curb. She kept the paper tucked in cloth, as if preserving a relic. She ate rice and beans and studied chapter headings in the 30 minutes between shifts. She kept herself unremarkable on purpose. It let her perform the work of keeping unnoticed things from vanishing. Aaliyah liked the anonymity of it. She liked that the good she did not automatically come with a spotlight. When you are 22 and you live in the city, you become adept at carrying things that look heavier than they should. You carry hope like a scarf, and you carry anxiety in the pocket of your coat like spare change. Promises become small tools you use to fix what is broken for an hour at a time. The envelope was such a tool, a token of duty and of faith. The days moved forward. The hospital arranged for an evaluation. The social worker's notes expanded into letters and referrals. Aaliyah balanced the administrative chores against her classes and job. She navigated lines of people with forms that never quite matched what she needed. Sometimes, in the spaces between tasks, she would hold the shoebox and imagine the long route of paper through the hands of office clerks and men in suits. She imagined the envelope arriving at some sterile desk and being opened by someone who might say, "Oh, yes," and then make something happen. Mostly, she imagined little things. She imagined George sitting in a more stable bed, a cup of coffee steaming beside him, that dignity intact. She imagined the photograph of him in uniform framed and placed somewhere not forgotten. She imagined that a sealed paper could be a way to connect two different economies, the economy of people who give what they can, and the economy of institutions that are supposed to make things right. She did not yet know the scale of the inertia she would have to face. She did not yet know how redacted records could be both shield and barrier. She did not yet know how an envelope addressed to someone who had always been overlooked could send ripples into rooms that made decisions for millions. She only had the quiet, practical fact of the sealed paper in her pocket and the moral fact of a promise she had given. On an ordinary Sunday, After a 10-hour shift and a lecture on patient assessment that left her mind buzzing with signs and symptoms, Aaliyah sat down at her kitchen table and wrote a short list. Call the VA intake line. Ask the social worker at the hospital what forms he would need. Check with Mrs. Carter about shifts. Pay the electric bill. On the bottom of the list she wrote in a different hand, like a line from another life. Mail envelope if necessary. She left the list there, folded it beneath a mug with a chip on the rim, and the word hope printed in a font that had been chosen by someone who wanted something that read good. The shoebox rested beside it. The envelope inside it kept its secret. A month after the day he had asked her to promise, the city was a little colder and the morning light a little thinner. Aaliyah's schedule remained the same. Coffee, a sandwich, a bus, scrubs, textbooks, washing dishes until her hands were red. The small straight line between the bus stop and the hospital felt like the only geography she could navigate without a map. One morning, she found a man in a suit standing a few paces away from the corner where George sat. He had an expression that belonged to people who knew how to move through crowds without being moved by them. His jacket was pressed and his shoes were clean. He made a note when he saw her and gave a small, polite nod that suggested recognition without engagement. She interrupted herself from reaching into her pocket to smooth the towel over the envelope because some part of her did not want to perform an act of faith when felt surveilled. That week, a storm came quickly out of the north, and the city unrolled rain like a public exhibit. George came to the bus stop with his hair plastered to his forehead and a look that suggested he had been awake for a lifetime. He asked her that day a question that felt deceptively small. "Do they remember us?" he asked, eyes squinting as if he were trying to see into the future. Aaliyah didn't answer immediately. She had no institutional voice and no set of facts to recite. She had only the experience of occasionally being on the receiving end of a system that sometimes recognizes, sometimes forgets, and sometimes pretends not to see at all. She thought of the shoebox, the envelope, the folded photograph with the neutral smile. She thought of the things people say when they are trying to make sense of their lives. Finally she said, "I try to remember." He nodded, as if the answer satisfied him in the way that small truths often do. He leaned back against the pole and closed his eyes. The city moved around them, people moved in and out of their lives, and everything kept turning on a wheel that was indifferent to both dignity and erasure. That afternoon, on her break, Aaliyah sat under a street lamp and took out the envelope. For a moment she considered opening it right there, in the light of a lamppost where everything looked honest. She held it up to the sky as if the moon might help her read what it contained, without violating his confidence. She did not open it. She felt the rightness of closure, the way some people feel the rightness of prayer. She slipped it back, wrapped in the towel, into her inner pocket, and went back to the hospital, where other people's lives required her attention. Promise is a funny currency. It doesn't always buy you the thing you hope for. Often, it buys you responsibility. A small, practical responsibility had shifted under her feet, and with it the outline of a narrative that might ask for more than sandwiches and early morning words. She did not yet know how those things would unfold. She only knew that when she left food at his door that morning, she hadn't imagined the doors it would open. Weeks turned into the rhythm of hospital shifts and library study. She checked in with social workers, with advocacy groups who offered advice in clipped emails. She brought him soup that night and a second cup of coffee, smoothing the napkin over a paper bowl the way someone tucks a blanket around the edges of a sleeping child. The machines in the room beeped and kept time with each small gesture, and for a while it felt as if the world reduced to the two of them, and the steady, modest work of staying awake for someone else. George's condition was fragile in ways that didn't translate neatly into the hospital's charts. The doctor said words like complications and comorbidities and monitor, and the social workers filled squares on forms that would, in theory, open doors to longer care. But there was always a lag between clinical language and the human business of being tended. Aaliyah hovered in that lag, translating for herself. More blankets, softer words, a hand to hold when the world scraped sharp edges against him. He rallied one afternoon, speaking in a voice that rasped around the corners of sentences. He asked her about small things, brown sugar for his coffee, the exact brand of soap he preferred when he could choose, and when she laughed at how specific some of his preferences were, he smiled like a man remembering a life with enough detail to make it his own. He asked about her classes and listened intently when she outlined a paper she had to write. Those small exchanges felt like stitches in a life that had been unpicked. Together they mended the immediate rents. Then, in the quiet hours just after dawn, when the hospital's corridors felt particularly thin and exposed, George's breathing changed. The monitors tightened their rhythms into a harsher music. Nurses moved, doctors entered, and the small gestures fractured into the clinical choreography of final care. Aaliyah held his hand until the machines made the last, small sound. There was no angelic revelation, no cinematic hush, just the practical, sorrowful closing that often follows a life. The call to next of kin, the arrangement of forms, the slow, bureaucratic application of procedures that never quite fit the person they describe. When the doctor said the words without flourish, Aaliyah felt a strange lightness and a weight all at once. It was as if someone had removed an object that had been pressing against her ribs for weeks, and then left her with the work of naming what that object had been. She sat with Mrs. Carter and Dr. Patel and Rachel in a small, sterile room off the ward, and they made the smallest, most human decisions a group of strangers could make. Who would be notified? Who would be present? How the hospital would care for his remains until arrangements could be made. George's effects, an old wallet, the photograph in uniform, the sealed envelope with Aaliyah's name, were folded into a small kit the hospital kept for such moments. The shoebox she'd hidden the original envelope in felt ridiculous suddenly, like a child's shrine that had outlived its season. She took the shoebox to the social worker and watched as professionals took on the legal and procedural tasks she could not perform. Notifying next of kin, certifying death, handling paperwork that had to be processed before anything else could be. In the days that followed, grief arrived not as a single sharp instrument, but as a series of small, persistent inconveniences. There were coroner's forms, and a hallway lined with plastic chairs and people who needed to be called. Mrs. Carter covered shifts at the hospital, so Aaliyah could sleep and made sure food appeared on her plate. Dr. Patel sat with her and explained, gently, about benefits that might be available and the difficulties that blacked-out records posed to those claims. Often these records are incomplete, she said. Sometimes redactions mean certain benefits can't be verified without additional review. Aaliyah did what she had promised. She mailed the envelope. It was a small act performed at a city post office that smelled faintly of paper and toner and the cigarette smoke of people who had stood too long on the street. She bought an extra sheet of mailing tape, wrapped the envelope in brown paper, and addressed it carefully with the information he'd scribbled on the front weeks earlier. The name and a destination that sounded official, like an address at a building that contained both bureaucracy and authority. She dropped it into the slot and watched it slide away, thinking of the 1,000 hands it might pass through on a route she could not see. Then for a while, nothing changed that she could perceive. The city kept its indifferent rhythm. Her mail continued to be misdelivered once, and then corrected. The hospital paperwork moved through managers, who referred her to liaisons, and then to liaisons. She sat in waiting rooms and listened to the rustle of clipboards. Sometimes she felt like her small fidelity had changed nothing at all. But the postal system has its own ways of creating trouble or miracle, and sometimes pieces of paper arrive exactly where they are meant to. 3 weeks after she mailed what George had asked her to mail, she was at the small sink in her kitchenette, scrubbing a coffee cup, when someone knocked on her door in a manner that did not belong to a delivery or a neighbor. The knock was formal, 3 sharp official taps, and it carried a kind of gravity that made the pigeons outside quiet their small governments. She opened the door to find 2 men in uniform and a woman in a coat that suggested she belonged somewhere with thicker carpets and less steam. Their shoes were precise, their badges unambiguous. One of the men, Officer Martinez, Aaliyah later learned, held an envelope in his gloved hands. It was sealed, official-looking, the paper thick in a way that made the sound of it on his palm like the closing of a book. "Ms. Aaliyah Cooper?" he asked. His voice was low and exact, the voice of someone trained to deliver simple facts. "Yes," she said, the single syllable feeling like a rope thrown into deep water. "We're here on behalf of the Department of the Army," the woman said, Colonel Hayes's representative, a liaison whose name was crisp on the card she offered. "We received a communication regarding George Fletcher. May we come in?" For a long moment, she did not move. There is an intimacy to your own doorway, and letting strangers cross that threshold feels like letting them step into a private geography. But the envelope in Martinez's hand felt like proof that whatever she had mailed had found its destination, and that destination had apparently reached back to her. She stepped aside. They sat at her small kitchen table with military decorum that tried to make itself polite in a cramped, humble room. The envelope came between them like a token, its formality at odds with the chipped mug marked hope on her counter. The colonel's aide, Officer Carter, placed it on the table and turned it over with a precise movement. On the front, in George's handwriting, was Aaliyah's name. "We're sorry for your loss," the colonel said. "As you might know, Mr. Fletcher is a veteran. Some aspects of his service are classified. We would like to invite you to the Pentagon to discuss his records and to explain the circumstances of his service through appropriate channels." A line loosened in Aaliyah's chest she hadn't known had been held tightly. This envelope, once a private relic in a shoebox, had become an invitation to a place most people only ever saw on television. The colonel's face did not celebrate that. His duty was to perform recognition and to facilitate processes that often felt abstract. Still, in the tight hold of his gloved hands, there was an acknowledgement she had not expected, that someone's life, even one lived mostly in a cardboard enclosure, could register on the institutional scale. "Will you come with us?" the colonel asked. "We can arrange transportation and a liaison to accompany you." She thought of her classes and Mrs. Carter's shifts and the rent she still needed to pay. She thought of George's photograph folded into the pocket of an old jacket, of the shoebox, of the promise she had given at dawn. She thought of every ordinary thing she had let continue while she kept a private watch over someone else. Ultimately, she said yes. The trip to the Pentagon felt like walking into a machine designed to make everything inside it appear to move with purpose. The corridors were broader than any street she had ever lived on, the carpeting stiffer, the air tempered to a temperature that felt like institutional calm. They led her to a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and varnish, where a woman with silver hair, General Victoria Ashford, stood and offered her a handshake with a firmness that balanced formality and warmth. General Ashford had the kind of presence that made people speak with the particular crispness required by official rooms. But she listened with an attention that was not merely procedural. As Aaliyah told the story, short phrases of morning bread and cold coffee, a promise given on a curb, a letter sealed and mailed, the general's expression shifted in ways that made the words themselves change their weight. There was pity there, but also recognition, and when Ashford spoke, it was with an apology that felt like a policy, and with promises that were, by design, cautious. "We are aware that the system fails certain veterans," Ashford said. "Classified records create legitimate barriers to access, but they also create blind spots. We need to examine where those blind spots have consequences for people who served and for the communities where they live." Ashford explained that George's records were indeed redacted in several places, and that the department would begin an internal review to see what could be declassified or verified for benefit purposes. She told Aaliyah that the Office of the Inspector General would audit procedures and that a liaison would be assigned to help with paperwork. The language was careful and measured, but there was an undercurrent of urgency in her voice that made Aaliyah understand the scale of what could be set in motion by simple human insistence. "What do you want from me?" Aaliyah asked, surprising herself with the directness of the question. "Truth," the general replied. "Tell us exactly what happened. Names matter, details matter, not to sensationalize, but to correct the record where it should be corrected." They asked if she would be willing to speak, truthfully, plainly, before a congressional committee that had begun looking into veterans' care and the way classified records complicate benefit adjudication. Aaliyah hesitated in the small private place that opened in her throat, to stand and tell a story in public. She imagined the bright lights and the cameras and the synthetic empathy of television panels. She imagined, too, the possibility that her words might do something other than settle in a file. They might rattle loose a hinge in a system that otherwise never feels a breeze. She said yes. Preparation for the hearing was a slow, strange education. Officials from the general staff walked her through the logistics: where to sit, how long she could speak, what kinds of documents would be allowed into the record. A media trainer, gentle, patient, taught her how to keep her sentences plain and how to answer questions without being led into traps of speculation. Mrs. Carter drove her to the dry cleaner and lent her a jacket that looked like it belonged in a grown-up closet. Dr. Patel sat with her and rehearsed the timeline, helping her keep the facts straight. The mornings at the bus stop, the envelope, the hospital intake with the redacted file, his death. There were, in those rehearsals, small moral choices. Would she speak with a lyricism that might move a room? Would she sanitize the story for the cameras? The people preparing her for the hearing urged clarity and economy. They told her that her voice would be most powerful if it was simple, if she said what she knew, and nothing she didn't. That felt right to her. She had no desire to become a spectacle. She wanted only to represent George, as he had asked her to, in the way that a promise demands. When the day of the hearing came, the chamber felt both enormous and intimate. Senators sat in high-backed chairs and listened with the professional attention of those who have built careers out of the economy of question and response. There were bright lights and a room full of aides and reporters jockeying for position. General Ashford sat to one side, looking composed. Colonel Hayes and Officers Martinez and Carter were present, their uniforms a quiet testimony to the institution that had shown interest in the life of a man named George Fletcher. When she took the microphone, Aaliyah felt the small, private geography of her life expand to fill a public theater. Her hands were steady despite the small tremor she felt in her chest. She said plainly, "I just left food at his door. I did what I could do. I brought him breakfast. I listened. When he asked me to mail a letter if something happened, I promised him I would. I did not expect anything else. I did not expect to be in this room." Her testimony was spare and unadorned. She spoke of mornings at 6:15, of a thermos steaming in the cold, of the photograph folded into a coat pocket. She said how the hospital had found redacted documents and how those redactions meant that someone with a life of service could be reduced to an absence of records. She said simply that the human cost of such absence was that dignity got lost on the way from one office to another. Senators asked procedural questions: how long she had known George, what the envelope contained, whether she had tried to find family members. Her answers were direct. When asked whether she believed the system had failed him, she said, without flourish, that it had failed to notice him when notice mattered. That answer did not indict a party or a person. It indicted a process that allowed redactions and missing files to become obstacles to care. Her words landed in the room the way small stones land in a quiet pond. The ripples took time to reach the edges, but they were inevitable. Reporters wrote down the detail of morning sandwiches and the improbable photograph in a pocket. Editorial pieces would later call her testimony plain truth and a morality in the form of a woman's morning routine. But for Aaliyah, the moment was less about being quoted than about seeing institutional mechanisms, clerks, redactions, bureaucratic inertia, respond to the intimacy of human story. After the hearing, there were concrete promises that had the legal language of process but the ethical weight of consequence. The Inspector General promised an audit of cases where redaction had impeded benefits eligibility. A task force would be convened to review how classified records were flagged, and to consider how to protect both security and human access. The department announced the creation of a memorial fund, initially seeded with internal donations and procedural pledges, to provide immediate, non-bureaucratic aid to veterans identified as at risk while their cases were adjudicated. "We cannot promise to fix everything," General Ashford said in a public statement, "but we can promise to look, to account, and to act where we find omission and harm." The language was cautious, but it contained the outline of change: auditing systems, improving liaisons, creating an emergency fund to serve those who fell through redaction's cracks. There were skeptics, as there always are, who asked whether one testimony could move structural processes. There were also staffers who, in quieter rooms, began to open files that had not been touched in decades. A few clips showed Aaliyah leaving the hearing, brushing rain from her hair, folding herself back into the ordinary life that had been hers before the cameras. The world of news moved on, but the administrative world, slow and incremental, began to adjust. In the months that followed, there were measurable changes and emphatic ambiguities. The audit turned up a handful of cases where redactions had delayed crucial benefits. The task force recommended a protocol for expedited review of cases involving deceased or incapacitated veterans, and suggested a liaison program to assist community members who might stand in for family. The Memorial Fund, later named the Fletcher Fund by a press release that made Aaliyah wince at its sudden publicness, was established to provide immediate financial assistance for funerals, emergency housing for at-risk veterans, and a small stipended position for community liaisons who could help navigate forms and records. No law fixed everything. No single bureau underwent a cultural conversion overnight, but there was momentum. Congress discussed a bill, later referred to in local reporting as the Fletcher Act, that aimed to create a transparent process for verifying benefits in cases involving restricted records. The act included provisions for a rapid response team to be deployed when a veteran with redacted files entered emergency care. Language in the bill acknowledged that security concerns were real, but that they could not create permanent barriers to human dignity and care. Aaliyah did not become famous. She did, however, become a kind of steward. The Army liaison called and offered her a paid position as a community outreach coordinator to work with the Fletcher Fund. It was not a headline job. It involved helping people fill forms, accompanying them to appointments, sitting with veterans in clinics to ensure they were seen as whole people and not as envelopes of redacted text. She accepted. Her new role allowed her to bridge the two worlds she had always inhabited, the intimate economy of small acts and the large bureaucratic systems that too often misrecognize those acts. She learned how to read the redactions with a patience that felt like detective work, and how to insist, without anger, that records be reviewed. There were victories that felt immediate, a funeral paid for, a housing voucher issued, and there were disappointments that felt like knots. Still, she found comfort in the steady, small work of showing up. The Fletcher Fund provided enough to cover the modest cost of a dignified burial and a temporary stipend for a few veterans whose files were in limbo. The community, Mrs. Carter, Dr. Patel, friends from the hospital, contributed in ways that mattered not for their size, but for their consistency. Casseroles at the home of a grieving widow, a volunteer to help fill forms, a driver to take someone to an intake appointment. Word moved slowly through neighborhoods and shelters. People who had once been invisible began to be seen in increments. A consequence of the publicness was that George's photograph traveled. It appeared in a small, then larger, news feature, and people recognized in the neutral steadiness of his expression the lives of many who had returned, altered, and then been thrust into invisibility. Requests came asking whether he had family, whether someone could claim his remains for military honors. When his next of kin could not be located, the department arranged for a reinterment with honors that acknowledged his service without revealing operational details. A respectful public recognition that was modest and appropriate. The day of the reburial at Arlington was cold and clear. Aaliyah wore the jacket Mrs. Carter had lent her and carried a sandwich wrapped in wax paper out of habit, more as a ritual than because she expected anyone to eat it there. Near the graveside, a small group gathered. The colonel who had first come to her door, General Ashford's aide, a representative from the local VA, a nurse who had cared for George, and a few neighbors and hospital friends. The ceremony was quiet and brief. The flag was folded with careful respect. An honor guard stood, their movements spare and precise. When the boots of the soldiers moved away from the grave and the small group dispersed into the fragrant pines, Aaliyah found herself at the headstone. She placed the wax paper sandwich on the stone, an act that felt like the closing of a circle. It was, to her, the most honest thing she could do. To leave the food that had started the whole chain of events, and to trust that in so doing she kept a promise not only to George, but to the idea that small human acts are a form of care worthy of ceremony. Months into her work with the fund, Aaliyah met people who changed the contours of what she thought possible. A young veteran with a limp and a degree in computer science who had been sleeping on a friend's couch found help to get into a program for transitional housing. An older woman who had served in logistics but whose records were redacted for decades finally received acknowledgement and a small compensation that allowed her to afford a proper apartment. Each case was its own world, and Aaliyah learned to accept that not every intervention solved systemic injustice. Still, many of those small solutions added up. Sometimes the wins were bureaucratic and small. A redaction reviewed and reduced, a benefit approved, a medical appointment expedited. Sometimes they were human and enormous, a funeral arranged for someone who would otherwise have been buried in an anonymous plot, a family traced and reunited. She kept a ledger, not because numbers were the only measure of success, but because tangible records mattered in a system that revered proof. The fund disbursed money in tiny increments. The outreach program paired volunteers with those who needed steady help. The ripple effects were modest but real. Her life settled into a new rhythm that still included early mornings at the bus stop. She did not abandon the ritual that had begun it all. On weekdays, she still wrapped a sandwich and poured a cup of coffee, and she sat on the curb and listened to stories about places she could not name, and about people who had made peacetime lives feel precarious. Sometimes newcomers would grin at the oddity of the ritual. A woman in scrubs who worked at the hospital and who once had barely had enough for rent bringing breakfast to a man on cardboard. When asked why she did it, she would say simply that it mattered to her that people be seen. She also began to mentor others. A young woman named Latrice, who had been a volunteer at a shelter and who wanted to study social work, shadowed Aaliyah and learned how to fill forms and how to sit with someone while paperwork was processed. Aaliyah taught her how to translate the cold terms of bureaucracy into something like advocacy. She taught the practical rituals of the job, how to bring socks to a discharge appointment, how to insist on being in a meeting when a veteran could not advocate for themselves. There were days, many days, when the work felt like friction against a vast stone. She encountered offices that moved too slowly, case managers whose caseloads were impossibly large, and red tape that somehow never acknowledged urgency. At times, she spoke bluntly to officials, and at times she learned that gentle persistence worked better. Her voice learned a new register, the one that balanced human insistence with procedural savvy. She did not seek praise for it. The work's reward was quieter, a returned call, a veteran who finally slept in a bed that wasn't borrowed, a family who could have a funeral with care. The Fletcher Act moved through committees with the halting momentum of most legislation. It was amended, some of the language watered down to pass muster, but the core of it, the idea that administrative secrecy must be balanced against human consequence, remained. The Act created a pilot program for expedited record reviews and funded a number of community liaison positions. It was not a sweeping fix. It was a start. For Aaliyah and for many who had been working on the edges of these problems, a start was something to be built upon rather than celebrated as an end. Over the next year, the fund disbursed support to a continuum of needs: emergency housing, funeral costs, short-term stipends to families navigating long waits for benefits. The Inspector General's audit produced recommendations for how to flag at-risk veterans and how to make sure that redactions had human-level oversight. General Ashford, in a memo circulated to her department, reinforced the need for liaison roles and the human review of redacted cases. The Army's internal review did not reveal dramatic malfeasance. What it did reveal was a pattern of administrative neglect, files mismatched, names misfiled, a structure designed for security sometimes incompatible with humane adjudication. Aaliyah worried, of course, that attention could fade. Institutional attention often runs on cycles: crisis, response, then a thinning of care. She learned to watch for those cycles and to build structures that did not depend solely on public drama. The Fletcher Fund's board included community members who knew how to keep work slow and steady. Mrs. Carter, who never sought a title beyond being someone who cooked with warmth, became a volunteer coordinator. Dr. Patel continued to advocate for vulnerable patients inside the hospital system. Their small insistence created a scaffolding that sustained the programs when headlines moved on. Sometimes, late at night in her tiny room above the laundromat, Aaliyah would pull the shoebox from under the bed. She would take out the envelope, the one he'd handed her at the bus stop, the one that had set so much in motion, and touch the fold of paper. It had lost some of its crispness. The ink on the front had softened at the edges with time and handling. She would remember the morning she had put a thermos on cardboard and how small that act had felt then. She would feel the magnified consequences of tiny kindness and be for a moment almost overwhelmed by the reach of such a simple choice. Years later, when people asked about George, they sometimes reduced the story to a journalistic neatness: a young woman, a sandwich, a veteran with a sealed envelope. But in the spaces between those simple facts were the messy human things that make a narrative real. The hospital staff who worked past shifts to get benefits moving, the colonel who had the courage to bring an envelope to a woman's door instead of letting it sit in a file, the interns who translated redacted lines into human needs, the community friends who baked casseroles and covered shifts so a woman could sleep. The story, like most durable truths, belonged to many hands. At Arlington, some years after the reinterment, Aaliyah returned not because of headlines, but because of the ritual she believed in. She brought a sandwich and sat on the bench near the row where George rested. A young woman in a hoodie sat beside her, one of the many people Aaliyah had been mentoring, someone who had learned how to translate forms into action. They ate quietly, the kind of silence between two people who did not need to show grief to know it existed. "Do you think what we did made a difference?" the young woman asked, looking at the polished stones and the neat rows of names. Aaliyah considered the question, then reached into her coat and smoothed the wax paper of the sandwich. She thought of forms signed and liaisons assigned, of funerals afforded and housing secured, of the moderate changes that had threaded through paperwork into people's lives. It mattered, she said. It mattered that someone remembered him in the small way she could, and it mattered that institutions were reminded. That's not the same as solving everything, but it's a start. For him, it meant dignity in the end, and for others, it opened a door that had been closed. They stood together and walked among the stones, and when they reached George's marker, Aaliyah placed her sandwich on it, as if the small ritual were proof against forgetfulness. She said his name softly, and the young woman nodded in a way that suggested she understood the promise embedded in small acts. The work continued. The Fletcher Fund helped hundreds of veterans and families in its first years. The task force recommended protocol changes still being implemented. The act that bore George's name remained a modest but persistent legal reminder that security and humanity must be held in balance. Aaliyah's position evolved into a role that combined advocacy and training. She taught volunteers and social workers how to navigate the peculiarities of redacted records and how to sit with a person who needed their life acknowledged, not just their file processed. She never forgot the morning she placed a sandwich on wax paper and walked it across a cold curb. The memory kept her grounded. It reminded her of the smallness of beginnings and the peculiar arithmetic by which a single, unremarkable act can tot up into something larger. She kept mentoring, kept going to the bus stop when she could, kept cooking for those whose names she had learned. The last time she visited George's grave with a group of new volunteers, one held up the small photograph she always carried, a copy of the image found in his pocket. The face looked out with the same steady, neutral expression that had once been a private piece of evidence of a person. Around them, the group talked quietly, planning a fundraiser dinner for the fund, drafting volunteer rosters, and sharing stories of veterans whose lives had been steadied by a form filled because someone insisted they must be. "The smallest thing you can do," Aaliyah would say in training sessions, "is to notice. Then do the next small thing, then the next." She used the sandwich as an emblem, a practical object that encapsulated a moral calculus. Feed a person, listen, keep a promise. Those small acts lined one after another into a path someone could follow. If you find yourself thinking about the story, if the image of a thermos steaming beside a cardboard cushion lingers, you might for a moment consider something you can do this week for someone overlooked. It need not be grand. A sandwich, a conversation, a phone call to a local shelter to ask how you can help. These are not cures, but they are the beginnings of recognition. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that attention matters. And if you want to go further, look up local veteran support organizations and community outreach programs to learn how you can responsibly contribute. When Aaliyah walks to the bus stop on cold mornings now, the city seems slightly less indifferent. There are more people who know how to file a form, and more staff who will sit with a veteran while their case is reviewed. None of those things erase the structural problems that create invisibility. They simply make the edges less sharp. The envelope that once lived in a shoebox has become, in small ways, part of an institutional memory that refuses the easy erasure of a life. At 6:15 one morning, as steam rose from a thermos and the light over the corner flickered on, Aaliyah set down a sandwich on wax paper at the foot of a headstone. She straightened the paper, smoothed the folds, and for a second the world felt aligned around the simple honor of feeding another. Then she rose, folded her scarf, and walked away, carrying with her the quiet knowledge that promises kept at a curb can become the hinge for change in rooms where decisions are made.